The land was silent, the kind of silence that presses against a man's soul. Caleb Blackwood had lived with it so long, it had become part of him. At 38, he moved like a man carved from the same rock and wind that shaped the Montana plains. His cabin stood alone against miles of open land, its weathered boards groaning under the endless sky. Every sound was his own. The creak of leather, the scrape of a chair, the slow breath of a man who had forgotten what laughter felt like. Caleb's life was a rhythm of work and solitude. Dawn found him mending fences, feeding cattle, and checking water lines that stretched across the valley. Dusk brought him back to his cabin, where a single lamp flickered against the walls and a wooden horse, his son's, sat untouched on the mantel. 3 crosses on the hill watched over him, 1 tall for his father, 2 small for the wife and child the fever took 7 years ago. He never went near them except to mend the fence. He didn't need to. Their memory lived in everything he touched. The land gave nothing freely. Winters were cruel, summers dry and punishing. But to Caleb, it was all he had left. The silence was his company, his punishment, and his protection. That was until the morning the stagecoach rolled into Redemption and brought with it a woman who would change everything. Her name was Alara. She stepped down from the coach with a single worn valise and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. The town was small. A few wooden buildings, a saloon, a church that leaned a little to the right, and a mercantile run by a man named Henderson. Folks in Redemption didn't take kindly to strangers, especially women alone with no story to tell. Alara didn't talk much. She asked Mr. Henderson for work, and after a long look, he agreed to let her mend clothes and tend the shelves. She worked quietly, never complained, never gossiped, and walked straight back to her small rented room above the store each evening. But quiet women in small towns draw louder whispers than any scandal. Where's she from? Why's she alone? Looks like trouble, if you ask me. Quote, Martha Holt, the preacher's wife, was the first to turn suspicion into judgment. Soon others followed. Men watched her with curiosity. Women watched her with disapproval. Alara ignored them all. Her life was a careful balance. Work, eat little, speak less, survive. The first time Caleb saw her, he was at the mercantile, buying supplies. He stood near the barrels of coffee and nails while she measured fabric for another woman. He heard the whispers, saw the way Henderson's sharp eyes followed her hands. When it was his turn, he placed his list on the counter. Their eyes met. Her face was calm, polite, but her eyes, those gray-green eyes, held something that made him forget to breathe for a moment. It was pain, quiet, and deep, like his own. She spoke softly, counted his change. Their fingers brushed, and she flinched like she'd been burned. He said nothing, just tipped his hat and left. But the image of her lingered long after he'd ridden home. A week later, the sky turned gray, the color of pewter. The wind came first, sharp and wild, rattling shutters and sweeping through the grass like a living thing. Then the snow fell, heavy, fast, blinding. It wasn't a storm. It was a wall of white that swallowed the world. Alara had been sent to deliver a small parcel to a farm a few miles outside town. She thought she'd return before the weather turned. But the storm had other plans. The road vanished. Her horse panicked and stumbled, snapping the wagon shaft. She was thrown into the snow, her thin coat no match for the cold. She tried to walk, to lead the horse, but the world was nothing but wind and white. Her limbs went numb, her breath shallow. She sank beside the broken wagon, the snow piling over her like a grave. Miles away, Caleb was out checking the northern fence line. He rode with his head bent against the wind, his horse Silas steady under him. When the animal suddenly stopped and whinnied, Caleb looked up. Through the swirling snow, he saw something dark, half buried near a drift. He dismounted, trudging through the knee-deep snow. It was a wagon, overturned and frozen. Beside it, a body, a woman. Her skin was pale blue, her hair stiff with frost. For a moment, he thought she was dead. Then he saw her chest move, barely. It was her. The quiet woman from the mercantile. He hesitated only for a heartbeat. Bringing her back meant breaking the walls he'd built, but leaving her meant letting her die. That he could not do. He lifted her in his arms, light as a child, and rode hard through the storm, the wind screaming in his ears. At the cabin, he built a fire so high it nearly smoked the roof. He laid her on his cot, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, and rubbed warmth into her hands. When he touched her skin, she whimpered in fear even in her unconsciousness. He drew back, his heart twisting at the sound. Whoever she was, she carried ghosts far heavier than the storm outside. Through the night he worked, warming broth, checking her pulse, listening to her mutter words he couldn't understand. Sometimes she cried softly, calling out names that no one would ever answer. He stayed awake beside her, staring into the fire, wondering what kind of life could carve such fear into a soul. By morning, the storm raged harder, trapping them together. He spoke little, just kept her alive. 2 days passed before her fever broke. When her eyes finally opened, dazed and frightened, he was sitting in his chair by the fire. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My ranch," he said. "You were lost in the storm." Her eyes flicked around the cabin, then back to him. "You should have left me." Caleb frowned. "Ain't the kind of man who leaves someone to die." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. He saw something in her expression, a kind of shame mixed with gratitude. She tried to speak again, but couldn't find the words. He handed her water instead. They said nothing more that day. The blizzard howled outside, and the fire cracked inside. Two strangers, bound by snow and silence, waited for the storm to end, both unaware that this frozen night was only the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. The storm ended as quietly as it had begun. By the third morning, the sun broke through, turning the snow-covered world into a blinding sea of white. Caleb stood outside his cabin, the cold biting through his coat, watching steam rise from the horses in the corral. Inside, the woman was awake, weak, pale, but alive. When he returned, she was sitting up on the cot, staring at the fire as though unsure if it was real. Her hair hung loose around her face, the color of chestnut bark wet with snowmelt. She looked different in the light, less ghostly but still fragile. "You should eat," Caleb said, setting down a bowl of hot broth. She nodded but didn't reach for it. "I owe you my life," she murmured, her voice rough. "Don't owe me anything," he replied. "You'd have done the same." Her eyes lifted to his, steady but distant. "No, I wouldn't have. Not after what I've seen." He didn't ask what she meant. Some truths were like wounds. They bled worse if touched. When she was strong enough, he hitched his sleigh and took her back to town. The ride was silent, the air thick with things neither dared say. At the edge of redemption, she thanked him quietly and climbed down, her thin coat pulled tight around her. Caleb watched her go, a small figure swallowed by the white street, and felt an ache in his chest he couldn't name. Back at the ranch, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt heavier now, as if her voice still lingered somewhere inside those log walls. For Alara, redemption had turned colder than the blizzard. The same townsfolk who had whispered about her before now stared openly. Martha Holt led the charge with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. The story spread fast, that the strange woman had been found half dead on the ranch of a widower. The kind of talk that left stains that never washed away. Mr. Henderson at the mercantile no longer looked her in the eye. Customers stopped coming by for her mending. Then one afternoon, when the preacher's wife made a grand scene about a missing silver locket, everyone suddenly found their villain. The locket was discovered in Alara's sewing bag. She froze when Mr. Henderson held it up. "I didn't take it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I swear I didn't." Her words fell like snowflakes, soft, ignored, lost in the wind. Henderson's face was cold with false disappointment. "Best you leave town, miss, before the sheriff takes an interest." Alara walked out without a tear, her pride, the only thing she still owned. But once behind the door of her small room, the walls finally closed in. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking, whispering to the emptiness, "Not again, please, not again." That night, she made a choice. The kind that comes when there's nowhere else to turn. At dawn, she saddled a borrowed horse and rode toward the only place where she'd once been met with kindness, the Blackwood Ranch. Caleb was splitting wood when she appeared, riding slow, her head bowed. He stopped mid-swing, the axe buried in the block, and stared as she dismounted. "I apologize for intruding," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I've lost my position in town. I have nowhere to go. If you'd allow it, I could work here. I can cook, mend, clean, whatever you need done." Her words carried no self-pity, only quiet resolve. Caleb studied her for a long moment. He could see what it had cost her to ask. He knew the rumors, the cruelty of small towns. If he took her in, he'd become their next target. Yet as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he couldn't ignore, a mix of pride and desperation that mirrored his own reflection too perfectly to turn away. "I keep my own house," he said finally, "but the old cabin by the cottonwoods still stands. It's dry and sturdy. You can stay there. I'll pay what I can." Her lips parted in disbelief. "You would do that, after everything they're saying?" He met her gaze steadily. "Don't care what they say." Relief flooded her face, so strong she had to look away to hide it. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, swinging the axe once more, the sharp crack echoing across the yard. "We'll start in the morning." From that day forward, their lives settled into a quiet rhythm. Each morning she walked to the main house, her breath white in the cold air. Caleb had cleared a space for her at his kitchen table where she sorted through his ranch ledgers, old books filled with crooked writing and half-finished numbers. Her neat hands brought order to the chaos. In the afternoons, she mended harnesses, patched clothes, and cared for the animals. Caleb worked nearby, fixing fences or hauling feed. They rarely spoke beyond what was needed, yet a silent understanding began to form, a respect that deepened with each passing day. She noticed the way he never raised his voice, never looked at her with suspicion. He noticed how she sang softly to the horses when she thought no one was listening. In the still evenings, she sometimes left a pot of coffee brewing on his stove before returning to her cabin. He never mentioned it, but he always drank every drop. Weeks passed, and something unspoken began to take root between them. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile peace either had known in years. Then, one moonless night, the peace shattered. The wolves came down from the high country, their howls splitting the dark. Caleb was first to hear them, a low growl rising over the wind. He grabbed his rifle and a lantern, running for the pasture. The sheep were panicked, eyes flashing in the lamplight. "Get back!" he shouted, firing into the air. Suddenly, he heard a second voice, hers. "Caleb!" She came running through the cold, barefoot in her nightdress, a shawl thrown over her shoulders, a second lantern clutched in her hand. "What is it?" Quote, "Wolves," he said shortly. "Drive them toward the paddock." Without fear, she waded into the chaos beside him. Lantern light and gunfire cut through the night as they fought to save the flock. A wild ewe bolted, crashing into her. She stumbled back, catching herself on a splintered fence post. Pain ripped up her arm, but she kept going until the last wolf vanished into the dark. Only when silence returned did Caleb notice the blood seeping through her sleeve. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Let me see." He led her into the barn, lighting a lamp. When he rolled up her torn sleeve to clean the cut, he froze. His breath caught in his chest. There, on the soft skin of her arm, hidden beneath the tear, was an old, brutal scar. Raised, puckered, unmistakable. A burned brand. The letters S and C twisted together. Caleb stared, speechless. He had seen that mark before, years ago, on the gatepost of a homestead burned to ashes. Silas Kane. The name hit him like a hammer. The man whose greed and violence had poisoned the land, whose crimes had been buried beneath false law and silence. the man who'd been hunted, vanished, presumed dead. He looked from the scar to her face, and in that moment, he understood. The woman he'd saved from the snow wasn't a stranger at all. She was the ghost of a story he'd once heard told in whispers, the young wife who had died, or so they thought, when Cain burned her home to the ground. And now she sat before him, trembling, alive, and branded by the devil himself. Caleb's world stopped. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The air in the barn thickened around them. Alara saw the look on his face, the shock, the horror, and flinched. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "not again." Her plea broke something inside him, but Caleb didn't turn away. He didn't speak either. He only reached forward, his hands trembling, and took her arm gently in his. Caleb's rough hands trembled as he held her arm under the flickering barn light. The scar burned like a brand from hell, and in its twisted shape he saw all the horror the West could hide behind polite words and empty law. Alara turned her face away, tears spilling, despite her fight to hold them back. "I didn't ask you to save me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I just wanted to disappear. Please, not again. Don't look at me like that." But Caleb didn't speak. He didn't recoil. Slowly, he set aside the salve and reached for a clean cloth. With steady hands, he cleaned the wound she'd gotten from the fence. His touch was gentle, full of a wordless respect. "You don't have to talk," he finally said. "Not unless you want to. Whatever that mark means, it ain't who you are now." Quote. Alara looked at him then, really looked. In his weathered face she saw no pity, only quiet strength. The tears that had been trapped behind years of silence finally came. The following days passed in fragile calm. He said nothing about what he'd seen, and she said nothing about her past, but something deep and unspoken tied them together now, a bond made not of curiosity, but understanding. When they rode into town a week later for supplies, whispers followed them like shadows. At the mercantile, Martha Holt stepped right in their path, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Well, look who's found herself a new protector," she sneered. "Careful, Mr. Blackwood. That one brings trouble wherever she goes." Caleb turned his head slowly toward her. His gaze was steady, cold, and without a word he looked through her like she was made of dust. The preacher's wife faltered, her false smile trembling. She stepped aside, and the boardwalk went silent. That day, the town of Redemption learned that Caleb Blackwood was not a man to provoke. After that, Alara was left alone, but not forgiven. Doors stayed closed when she passed, and her name stayed on whispering tongues. Still, she found peace at the ranch. Caleb's quiet company became a refuge. She learned to ride the open range, to shoot straight, and to smile again, though only when she thought he wasn't looking. Then, one afternoon, Redemption changed forever. 3 fine wagons rolled into town, painted bright and driven by men in tailored coats. Their leader was tall, handsome, and too confident by half. His hair had turned silver at the temples, but his eyes were the same cold steel gray that haunted Alara's nightmares. Silas Cain, the man who had destroyed her life, had returned, no longer a wanted outlaw, but a rich land developer, come to claim the valley in the name of progress. When Alara saw him, she froze. The spool of thread she held rolled from her hand and bounced across the dusty road. Her heart stopped. The air left her lungs. She turned and ran, fear propelling her out of town and across the plains, until she reached the ranch, breathless and shaking. Caleb met her halfway across the yard. "What happened?" Her lips trembled. "He's here," she gasped. "Silas Cain, he's in Redemption." Caleb's blood ran cold. For years, the name had been a ghost from the past. Now that ghost had a body again. He gripped her shoulders firmly. "You're not running this time," he said, his voice calm but fierce. "This land is your home now. He won't take it." From that moment, he watched her as if she were the last light in the world. But Cain watched too. He wanted Caleb's ranch, the land, the water, everything. And when he realized who the rancher's woman truly was, his greed twisted into obsession. At first, he came with papers, fake claims, false surveys. When Caleb refused to sign, Cain sent men to poison the creek and stampede the cattle. Then Jed, Caleb's oldest friend, was found dead in a ravine. The sheriff called it an accident. Caleb knew better. Each loss brought them closer together. Fear turned to defiance. Grief turned to fire. Caleb taught her to shoot, his hands steadying hers as she aimed. "Breathe out slow," he murmured. "Don't fight the land. Listen to it." Quote, "Their closeness grew until one night, while the rain hammered the roof, she broke down in his arms, crying for everything she had lost. Caleb held her, his heart raw. "You're not cursed, Alara," he said. "You're the strongest soul I've ever known." When she kissed him, it was a promise of love, of survival, of the life they'd fight to keep. A week later, their chance came. Caleb spread word of a silver strike on his land, a lie meant to draw Cain in. It worked. Cain rode in with 6 men under cover of darkness, ready to kill. But the Devil's Jaw Canyon was waiting. Caleb knew every twist of it, every loose stone and echoing bend. He hid in the shadows, his traps set. Alara watched from the ridge above, the rifle steady in her hands. When Cain's men entered the narrow pass, Caleb cut the rope that held a mountain of loose rock. The canyon thundered as scree poured down, trapping them inside. Gunfire erupted. The echoes made it sound like an army. Alara's first shot struck true, scattering the riders. Caleb moved like a ghost between the stones, taking them down one by one. By dawn, only Cain was left. Caleb, bleeding from a bullet that grazed his ribs, faced him at the canyon wall. Cain raised his gun, smirking. "All this could have been yours, Blackwood, but you chose her. You'll die for it." A single rifle crack split the air. Cain staggered. Alara's bullet had found his shoulder. His gun went wild, the shot striking stone inches from Caleb's head. Caleb lunged, tackling him to the ground. They struggled in the dust, fury against fury. Then Cain's boots slipped, and his body slammed against the canyon wall. A loose boulder groaned above. Alara screamed his name. The rock came free with a roar, crashing down. The earth swallowed Silas Cain, the land itself delivering judgment. The silence that followed was heavier than death. Alara dropped the rifle and ran to Caleb, her hands trembling as she touched his bloodied face. He smiled faintly through the dirt and pain. "Told you I wouldn't let him touch you," he murmured. Weeks later, the snow returned, soft this time, gentle. On the hill behind the cabin, Caleb repaired the fence around the 3 graves. Alara stood beside him, holding a cup of water, her arm wrapped where the old scar had once shamed her. Now it marked survival. Below them, the ranch stretched wide and peaceful, the cattle calm, the sky endless and kind. The town of redemption had changed its tune, but Caleb and Alara didn't care for its gossip anymore. They had found their own redemption, in the silence of the land, in the fire that never died, and in each other. When the sun sank behind the distant mountains, Caleb slipped his hand into hers. No words were spoken, none were needed. The land was still, but no longer lonely. For the first time in years, the silence was not empty. It was full of life.